Good evening, friends, to our time of reading Adam Hamilton's 24 Hours That Changed the World. I'm going to be reading chapter 3 tonight, Condemned by the Righteous. But before I do, about a minute or so of instrumental music to give you a chance to sign in. This reading comes from Mark chapter 14. They took Jesus to the high priest, and all the chief priests, the elders, and the scribes were assembled. Now the chief priests and the whole council were looking for testimony against Jesus to put him to death. The high priest asked him, "Are you the Messiah, the Son of the Blessed One?" Jesus said, "I am. And you will see the Son of Man seated at the right hand of power and coming with the clouds of heaven." Then the high priest tore his clothing and said, "Why do we still need witnesses? You've heard his blasphemy. What is your decision?" All of them condemned him as deserving death. Some began to spit on him, to blindfold him, and to strike him, saying to him, "Prophesy." The guards also took him over and beat him. While Peter was below in the courtyard, one of the servant girls of the high priest came by. When she saw Peter warming himself, she stared at him and said, "You also were with Jesus, the man from Nazareth." But he denied it, saying, "I do not know or understand what you are talking about." After a little while, the bystanders again said to Peter, "Certainly you are one of them, for you are a Galilean." But he began to curse, and he swore an oath, "I do not know this man you're talking about." At that moment, the cock crowed for the second time. Then Peter remembered that Jesus had said to him, "Before the cock crows twice, you will deny me 3 times." And he broke down and wept. Thursday after midnight, the house of the high priest. From where he stood, Jesus could look across the Kidron Valley at the great wall of the temple, where earlier in the week he had taught. The people in the crowds whose adulation rang so loudly in his ears on Sunday were asleep following their own Passover celebrations. The disciples who had shared his life since he called the first of them on the edge of a Galilean lake had fled during the chaos that accompanied his arrest. Now, bound hand and foot by temple guards, Jesus was led back toward the city walls. They passed again the tombs of the ancient priests, tombs that are still there, and the gates where the book of Ezekiel says the Messiah will one day place his feet. They passed the temple, far below the lofty pinnacle where, we are told, Jesus was tempted by the devil, who dared him to cast himself down to prove, as the angels rushed to his aid, that he was indeed the Messiah. Down the valley they walked. Then they began pushing and pulling Jesus up the hill of Zion, making their way through the lower city of David, which had been built over 1,000 years earlier by that great king. They climbed the long stairway leading from the lower to the upper city, stairs that are still partially intact. Visitors may still walk on them, remembering and reenacting Jesus' journeys this night. I have trod them, walking barefoot on those stones, imagining this very night. Finally, after a 20-minute trek that had brought them about a mile from the garden, the guards led Jesus into the house of Caiaphas, the high priest. In the meantime, 2 of Jesus' disciples, Peter and John, had mustered enough courage to follow at a distance, hiding in the shadows, distraught and afraid. Once Jesus was in custody, the Sanhedrin, or Jewish ruling council, was called hastily to the grand hall of what was no doubt a palatial home befitting the high priest. Today, on the spot where the home is believed to have stood, is a church called St. Peter Gallicantu, the latter being a Latin word meaning cock crow. Below the ground is a prison cell, a cold stone pit fashioned from a cistern, and it is taught that this is where Jesus was held, lowered through a hole in the ceiling, first as the Sanhedrin debated his fate, and again as he awaited transport to Pontius Pilate after sunrise. It is not hard to imagine Jesus in that pit praying the words of Psalm 88. O Lord, God of my salvation, when at night I cry out in your presence, let my prayer come before you. Incline your ear to my cry. For my soul is full of troubles, and my life draws near to Sheol. I am counted among those who go down to the pit. The Sanhedrin was a council comprised of 71 elders who were considered to be among the wisest and most pious men of the time. The very idea of the council comes from Numbers 11:16, where God commanded Moses to gather 70 leaders who would join him in governing the people on God's behalf. In Jesus' time, the 71 men ruled over the religious affairs of the people, just as the Romans ruled over their political affairs. The Sanhedrin had control of the temple and the religious courts. They were men who devoted themselves to God, and their high priest was the leading religious figure of his time. The Sanhedrin normally met during the day in the temple courts and not during religious feasts. The fact that they were gathering in the high priest's palace at night during the Feast of Unleavened Bread points to both the unorthodoxy of the proceeding at hand and the urgency and secrecy they felt necessary in dealing with Jesus. We need to step back from this scene for a moment to recognize its full import and appreciate its tragic irony. Christians believe that in Jesus, God walked in human flesh on this earth. He was in that sense like an emperor who so desires to know his subjects that he dons ordinary clothing and lives among them, with no one recognizing or understanding him. The God of the universe chose to walk in human flesh as an itinerant preacher, teacher, carpenter, healer, and pauper. He came as one of us. He healed the sick, forgave sinners, showed compassion to the lost, and taught people what God was really like. We must not miss the irony here. It was not the sinners who arrested God when he walked among us. Those who took him into custody and tried him were the most pious and religious people on the face of the earth. The God they claimed to serve walked among them in the flesh, and they could not see him. They were so blinded by their love of power and their fear of losing it that they missed him. The people you would most expect to recognize and hail Jesus instead arrested him in darkness and brought him to trial. They put God on trial for blasphemy. Jesus' testimony that he was in fact the Messiah outraged them, and they found him guilty, convicting God of a crime worthy of the death penalty, blasphemy against himself. They spat on him, blindfolded him, and beat him. Prophesy to us, you Messiah, they yelled. Who is it that struck you? Then they turned him over to the guards to beat him again. The question we are meant to ask, the question we must ask, is how could this happen? How could 71 righteous men dedicated to God do what these men did? Why did they condemn an innocent man to death? And even if they thought he was a false Messiah, why would pious men, pillars of the community, spit on him? Why would they blindfold him, mock him, and strike him? The answer, I believe, is fear. These men saw Jesus as a threat to their way of life, their positions of authority, their status among the Jews. They had seen the crowds flocking to him and had heard them say, "What is this? A new teaching with authority. He commands even the unclean spirits and they obey him." Jesus threatened their very social order. The reaction of Caiaphas, the high priest, was equal to the perceived threat. "This man is dangerous," we can imagine him saying. "If people continue to flock to him, the Romans are going to get wind of this, and who knows what they'll do to our people." This might actually lead to a great deal of pain for the entire nation, certainly for us. It would be better for one man to die than for all the people to suffer. Jesus must die. The idea was not a hard sell to the others. Their inherent fear and insecurity worked on them, ate at them, and fear breeds hate, which all too often leads to tragic acts of inhumanity. This part of the story is not simply about 71 supposedly pious Jewish men in the first century. This is about the human condition. And I want to read I want to read that sentence again because it's still so true today. Fear breeds hate, which all too often leads to tragic acts of inhumanity. We're all born afraid. Part of that's a mechanism God has given us to protect ourselves. We call it the self-preservation instinct. That mechanism can be helpful in dangerous situations. There are times when we have to fight, to work, to exert energy in order to save ourselves, and there are also times when we need to run from a situation. Unfortunately, our self-preservation instinct is coupled with our sin instinct. There's something in all of us that's broken. We have a propensity to do the wrong thing, to twist what was meant to be good, to misuse it and distort it. You know this, and I know it. As we look at the Sanhedrin and their treatment of Jesus, I would ask you to consider the ways the story relates to you. Fear performs its poisonous work within all of us. How often are we still motivated by it? In what ways does our fear lead us, individually and as a nation, to do what is wrong, what is at times unthinkable, while justifying our actions as necessary? How was fear a part of the Salem witch trials in 1692 or of Joseph McCarthy's Red Scare in 1952? What role did fear play in the apartheid laws of South Africa or the Jim Crow laws of the United States? How did fear shape U.S. foreign policy during the Cold War and after 9/11? How has your fear led you to do things you later regretted? We must each be aware of the power of fear, and we must not forget the lessons of history. All of us, if we let our call to love be overshadowed by our innate fear, are capable of supporting and doing the unthinkable. Wow, this is deep. When I read the story of Jesus' trial before the Sanhedrin, I'm left wondering, would I have been among those who, out of fear and insecurity and the hate those feelings breed, would I have found Jesus guilty of crimes worthy of death? I've heard some of my non-religious friends say, I'd believe in God if he'd just show up, if he'd come and knock on my door, but God did that once. And this is what the human race did to him. Had you or I or my non-religious friends been there, I'm afraid we would have participated in these same things. I recognize myself in the Sanhedrin. I fear I would have made the same decision. Preachers know about fear. It's easy to use fear to motivate people in the church, and that's something we have to be careful about. Politicians do it too. Just watch the ads they run. And unfortunately, those tactics too often work. The questions we must ask in our personal lives and in our public policy as Christians is not, what is the thing that will make me feel the most secure, but what is the most loving thing for me to do? In the end, love conquers in ways that fear and hate and violence simply cannot. That is what the Scripture teaches us about the ways of God. I'm reminded of this passage in 1 John, and he's quoting here my favorite passage of Scripture. God is love, and those who abide in love abide in God, and God abides in them. Love has been perfected among us in this, that we may have boldness on the day of judgment, because as he is, so are we in this world. There is no fear in love, but perfect love casts out fear. We love because he first loved us. Those who say, I love God, and hate their brothers or sisters are liars. For those who do not love a brother or sister whom they have seen cannot love a God whom they have not seen. 1 John chapter 4. I am certain that at least a few of those 71 Sanhedrin members must have questioned whether putting Jesus to death was the right thing to do. Some had to wonder whether this man might not truly be the Messiah. But there's nothing in any of the gospel accounts to indicate that a single one of them, other than Joseph of Arimathea, disagreed when it came to the death sentence they sought from Pontius Pilate. And that points to another fact of human existence. Resisting those in leadership, or the majority, even when we believe they're doing wrong, is exceedingly difficult. When the tide is moving, we tend to be afraid to stand up and resist. I've seen this in myself from time to time. There have been occasions when when authority said, this is the way we ought to go, and I didn't speak out for fear that doing so would make me look foolish. And he could be talking about the times we live in now, couldn't he? I have the feeling there were people in that Sanhedrin who said, why didn't I say anything? Martin Niemöller, a Lutheran pastor in Nazi Germany during World War II, saw the sins being committed against the Jewish people and at first decided not to object. Only later did he begin to speak out against what he had seen. Words attributed to Niemöller movingly express his analysis of the situation. First, they came for the communists, and I didn't speak up because I wasn't a communist. Then they came for the Jews, and I didn't speak up because I wasn't a Jew. Then they came for the Catholics, and I didn't speak up because I was a Protestant. And then they came for me. By that time, there was no one left to speak up anymore. I'm also reminded of a quotation from the 18th century British philosopher and politician Edmund Burke. The only thing necessary for evil to triumph is for good men to do nothing. Keeping silent, doing nothing when you see that something is wrong, is a sin. No one spoke up in the Sanhedrin. No one asked, is this really in keeping with our faith? How many times in recent history has the same thing happened? During the Holocaust, in Jim Crow America, in South Africa, at Abu Ghraib, and in your life and mine. How many times have we known something was wrong, but we're afraid to speak up? And I'm not talking about simply pointing out other people's sins. We all know Christians who freely point out the sins of others. They're not being courageous, just obnoxious. I'm talking about those times when you're part of a group about to do something that's wrong, or when you see injustice being done to somebody and all it would take would be one person speaking up, but everybody remains silent. What would have happened if one or two or three of those Sanhedrin members had simply said, this is not right, regardless of what we think about this man. It is not in keeping with what God has taught us. In our own situations, we must be able to say with great humility and despite our fear, you know this just doesn't feel right. In that pivotal moment when say something and you dare not say anything are both pounding in your head, say something. At the center of this storm stood Jesus, listening as these pious men looked for reasons to put him to death. He saw their growing frustration as the witnesses they brought in to testify against him told varying stories. According to Jewish law, two people had to agree in their testimony in order to convict, and there was no agreement here. Finally, they looked at Jesus, and the high priest said, "Are you the Messiah, the Son of the Blessed One?" All Jesus had to do was keep silent, and there would have been no grounds for conviction. Instead, he replied in a manner deemed blasphemous for Jews and traitorous for Romans. Jesus' response to this question of his identity brings together three Old Testament allusions, each of which assured his conviction by the Sanhedrin. Let's consider each one. Jesus' first statement is easy to read as a simple, literal answer to the question, "Are you the Messiah?" Mark records it as two Greek words, ego eimi, or I am. Caiaphas, though, realized this was not a simple declarative. The straightforward answer would have been, "I am he," or "I am the Blessed One," or even "I am the Messiah." But a simple "I am" in Greek seems to point towards something much more profound. In John's Gospel, the phrase has come to Jesus' lips time after time, so that scholars speak of the "I am" sayings of Jesus. And the significance of these words likely goes back to a key passage in the book of Exodus, where 1,200 years before Jesus, Moses saw a burning bush from which came the voice of God. When Moses asked God his name so he could tell it to the Israelites back in Egypt, God answered, "I am who I am." I am is therefore not simply the first person singular of the verb to be. In Hebrew, it is the personal name of God. In Hebrew, it was likely pronounced Yahweh, although it's often been mistranslated as Jehovah. In revealing this holy name to Moses, I believe God was saying, "I am the source of all life, and being itself comes from me." By recording that Jesus' first statement to the high priest was, "I am," I believe Mark intended for readers to see the connection between Jesus and his Father. Mark was stating what John records in the prologue to his gospel. In the beginning was the Word, and the Word was with God, and the Word was God. He was in the beginning with God. All things came into being through him, and without him not one thing came into being. What has come into being in him was life, and the life was the light of all people. Because of Jesus' first statement, "I am," Caiaphas tore his clothing and deemed Jesus guilty of blasphemy. But Jesus was not finished. In a second statement, he went on to say, "And you will see the Son of Man coming with the clouds of heaven," a reference to a passage beginning at Daniel 7:13. Jesus was counting on Caiaphas to fill in the blanks. Here's the passage. In my vision at night I looked, and there before me was one like a son of man coming with the clouds of heaven. He approached the Ancient of Days and was led into his presence. He was given authority, glory, and sovereign power. All nations and peoples of every language worshipped him. His dominion is an everlasting dominion that will not pass away, and his kingdom is one that will never be destroyed. Standing before the Sanhedrin, Jesus was identifying himself with the Messiah described in this passage from Daniel, noting that his glory, his rule over the entire earth, would come in the future, not in the present as the Jews had hoped. Jesus was saying that when the Messiah comes, he will rule, and God the Father will grant him dominion, authority, and power over all people. His will shall be done, and on that day all nations and all people will worship him, something reserved for God. Jesus also said to Caiaphas that he would see the Son of Man seated at the right hand of power. That is a reference to Psalm 110, where we read, "The Lord says to my Lord, sit at my right hand until I make your enemies your footstool. The Lord sends out from Zion your mighty scepter. Rule in the midst of your foes. Your people will offer themselves willingly on the day you lead your forces on the holy mountains. From the womb of the morning, like dew, your youth will come to you. The Lord has sworn and will not change his mind. You are a priest forever, according to the order of Melchizedek." Twice in the Gospels, we read that Jesus quoted this psalm, likely written for and about David, and both times he applied it to himself, making himself prophetic heir of its promise. In this passage, the Lord is speaking to Jesus, seating him at his right hand to rule. The enemies are those in that very room who will become his footstool. No doubt the members of the Sanhedrin again bristled as they recalled this psalm. The reference to Melchizedek goes back 1,600 years before the time of Jesus. Melchizedek was a king who had brought a meal of bread and wine to offer to Abraham, who had defeated Melchizedek's enemies in battle. The name Melchizedek in Hebrew means king of righteousness, and his act foreshadowed the bread and wine Jesus offers us in the Eucharist. Melchizedek is both king and priest, like Jesus, who is the king of righteousness and who acts as priest, offering himself to God on behalf of the people. Jesus was identifying himself as the one foretold from the time of the psalmist and foreshadowed in the mysterious Melchizedek. In this one sentence, 3 statements, Jesus testified that he was the Messiah, God's elect, and he alluded to a very special relationship between himself and God. Jesus was not merely a wonderful teacher, he was not merely a wonder worker, nor was he the political Messiah hoped for by the people. He understood himself to be closely associated with Yahweh, to be the promised Son of Man who would come again on the clouds, having been given rule over all people, and seated at the right hand of God, serving as both priest and king. The Sanhedrin learned enough to take in the full scope of Jesus' statements and claims, tore their clothing at the audacious enormity of it all, and said in effect, "Do we need any more witnesses? The man has blasphemed and is worthy of death." To them, Jesus stood convicted. The final act in this part of the drama, meanwhile, was taking place in the courtyard around a fire where Peter was warming himself, and we know what's coming. Peter's going to deny Jesus, an act for which he's still remembered. But as easy as it is to look down on him for denying Jesus, as easy as it might be to see him as a coward, it's important to recognize the courage Peter had demonstrated up to that point. When the guards came to arrest Jesus in the Garden of Gethsemane, it was Peter who drew his sword and showed himself ready to fight a detachment of armed guards. In fact, he lopped off the ear of the high priest's servant, Malchus. Jesus turned to Peter and said, "Put your sword back into its sheath. Am I not to drink the cup that the Father has given me?" Peter may have been misguided, but he was the one courageous enough to try to fight for Jesus. In the Gospels of Matthew, Mark, and Luke, we find that as Jesus was led away, the disciples fled, except for Peter. Peter followed the guards as they took Jesus to Caiaphas' house. He clung to the shadows, but when he got there, he steeled himself and entered the high priest's very courtyard to see what was happening. Do you see the courage it took to do that? Would you have walked into the courtyard knowing you could be put to death for being a follower of Jesus? Still, Peter's courage lasted only up to a point. Warming himself at the fire, he stood among the temple guards as the trial went on, but he was probably doing his best to conceal his identity. Then when a servant girl called attention to him, he began to waver. "You also were with that Nazarene Jesus," she said. "I know you were." At that moment, fear took over. Knowing he was in danger of being harmed, Peter would not stand up as one of Jesus' disciples. "I do not know or understand what you're talking about," he said. And he walked from the inner courtyard to the outer. The woman followed him and said again, "I know you're with him. I'm looking at you, and I know you're one of his disciples." And once more he denied it. Finally, a group of people had been watching him. Studying his easily identifiable Galilean accent, came up and said, "Surely you're one of them. You're a Galilean." Peter began calling curses from heaven upon himself, swearing to them, "I do not know this man you're talking about." At that moment, a rooster crowed for the second time, and Peter remembered what Jesus had said. "Before the cock crows twice, you will deny me 3 times. Luke tells us that at that instant, Jesus looked from inside the hall at Peter. And when their eyes met, this rugged, lifelong fisherman, this rough-hewn leader of Jesus' disciples, broke down and wept. This incident is one of the few that's mentioned in all 4 Gospels, so all 4 writers must have considered it important. It wasn't included in order to embarrass Peter. The Gospels were written, in fact, after Peter had been crucified upside down for his faith. The Gospel writers knew the story because Peter must have regularly told the awful truth of that episode himself. Think about that. He told this on himself. None of the other disciples except John was there. Peter must have told it when he went to preach. Peter would surely have said, "I know you've denied Jesus. I denied him myself. I denied him in a way that I'm deeply ashamed of, and yet I have to tell you, I betrayed the Lord, but he gave me grace. He took me back. And if you've denied him, he will take you back too." Peter wanted to reassure others that despite the fact there are times when all of us deny the Lord, he'll continue to take us back and use us to accomplish his work. From that moment forward, Peter would never again deny Jesus. They say that when you visit the Holy Land, you will inevitably have a moment when you find yourself transported back in time to experience some part of the gospel story. For me, this happened on the first night of my first trip to the Holy Land. It was March, about the time of year when Jesus was arrested. We were staying in a hotel atop the Mount of Olives overlooking the holy city, Jerusalem. I couldn't sleep, and though it was still dark, I got dressed, walked out in front of the hotel, and sat on a bench beneath an olive tree. I shivered in the cold and immediately began to think of Peter trying to warm himself in the fire at the high priest's courtyard. As I sat there lost in my thoughts, somewhere down the mount from the hotel, a rooster began to crow. Suddenly my mind was filled with all the times I had denied Jesus. I denied him when I said and did things I knew weren't in keeping with his will, when I engaged in thoughts and deeds that were counter to my faith, when I was more concerned with what others thought of me than what he thought of me, when I was afraid to stand up and be counted as one of his disciples, or when I did something I knew was wrong because other people were calling me to do it. I sat there on the Mount of Olives in the cool spring darkness and knew for a moment a taste of the grief and shame that brought Peter to tears. We can learn something from each of the participants in Jesus' trial before Caiaphas. The members of the Sanhedrin clearly illustrate the human tendency to allow fear to make us do what we know is wrong. In their case, it was their condemnation of Jesus, their blindfolding and beating of him, and the silence of those who knew it was wrong. Jesus' testimony is meant to teach us about who Jesus was and is. He's more than a great teacher, more than a prophet. He is the I Am, the priest king who will come one day on the clouds to reign over all. Peter's denial is a reminder that we who have answered the call to follow Jesus are tempted at times to deny even that we know him. And it serves as an invitation for us to be counted among his followers, regardless of the cost. Thank you for tuning in tonight, and I will see you again tomorrow night at 8 for Chapter 4, Jesus, Barabbas, and Pilate, if not before at 7 for our update. Please call me at 919-618-1090 or email me at rvspivey314@gmail.com if you need me for anything. God bless you, and I love you.